What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video, and welcome back to part number 3 of my home bar build. So in case you missed the first 2 parts of the video, I'll link to the playlist in the cards above. But in this video, I'm going to show you how I built these glass cabinet doors using cope and stick joinery using a pretty specialized router bit set. I really love the way these doors came together. I think they look awesome, and hopefully you guys will enjoy the video. Let's go ahead and get started.
Back to the home bar build, I could get to work on making the glass doors for the upper cabinets. And I went with white oak to match the plywood I used for the cabinets, and picked up some 4/4 boards from Asheville Hardware, my local lumber and woodworking store. I managed to find these super wide boards, which were really perfect for this project, since I could rip the door parts from the outside edges of the door, giving me mostly straight grain boards. And boards with straighter grain will tend to be more dimensionally stable, which is a very good thing when it comes to cabinet doors. I ripped the boards to rough width at the table saw, and then cut them to rough length at the miter saw. And I like to cut my boards as close to their final dimensions as possible prior to milling, as it'll usually mean less material has to be removed to get the boards flat. And speaking of milling, next I could get the boards milled perfectly flat on one face and one edge over at the jointer. And some of these boards had a pretty decent bow to them, so I really needed to flatten them out prior to moving forward. And when flattening boards at the joiner, I like to face the bowed face of the board towards the bed of the joiner, as I find you can usually remove less material this way. Also, when doing this, I try to only apply light pressure right at the ends of the boards, so that I don't flex the board, which would just temporarily push down the bow without actually removing it. After getting one flat face and edge at the jointer, I moved over to the planer to bring the other faces into parallel. So to set the cutting depth on my planer, which is something I don't think I've ever really explained before, I start with the bed lowered so that the board isn't contacting the feed rollers or cutter head. Next, I slide the board in so it's about halfway through the planer, and then raise the bed until the board just starts moving, and this is essentially my 0 point. Next, I'll raise the bed by moving the handle about another half turn, and then mark across the entire face of the board with my pencil. And this will just help to tell me how much of the surface of the board is actually being milled. Next, I run the board through again, and in this case, there were still some pencil marks left, so I raised the bed by about another half turn. After that pass, there were still a few pencil marks left at each end of the board, so I raised the bed about 1/4 of a turn, and then I could run all of the boards through. And I wanted to bring the boards down to final thickness in one pass, as I wanted to remove the minimum amount of material in the shortest time, and this allowed me to do that. I also ran the boards through with the end of the next board to be milled butted up against the previous board, which really helps to reduce planer snipe. With the boards of their final thickness, I could rip them to final width over at the table saw. And I made sure to use a feather board here to make sure I got nice clean edges. Finally, I could cut the boards to length at the miter saw, and I set up stop blocks to make sure my parts were the exact same size. With the door parts milled to final size, I could move on to cutting the joinery that holds the doors together, as well as the recess for the glass panel. And I used this 3-piece router bit set from Infinity Tools on this project, and am really happy with the finished result. The combination of these 3 bits cuts the cope and stick joinery, which is a traditional method of joining cabinet door parts, while at the same time cutting a rabbeted area for the glass. And the cool part about this set is that it also cuts a 1/4 round glazing strip which holds the glass in place. And this results in a seamless and super custom looking glass door, as opposed to using something like plastic clips to hold the glass in place, which I've done in the past. Anyway, to get started, I installed the first bit in the set, the rail cutter, which makes the cope cut across the ends of the rails. And the bit height on this first bit is kind of arbitrary. You really just want the bit cutting about halfway through the piece. And I set my bit slightly lower since I ended up with pieces slightly thinner than 3/4 of an inch, and this ended up working out fine. And I actually used a coping sled here, also from Infinity Tools, so I had to reset the bit height to account for the sled, and then I could set the fence so that it was in line with the bearing on the bit. And the fence here just helps to support the piece as it runs through the bit, and I used a straight edge to set the bearing in line with the fence. Finally, I could make my first test cut, and it went smoothly, except I forgot to use a backer board, so I got a little bit of blowout. With the test cut looking good, I went ahead and made the coping cut on each end of all of the rails, making sure to use a backer board each time. Also, one other thing to mention here, all of these cuts are made with the boards facing down on the router table, with the back of the boards facing you. And this means that any discrepancies end up on the back face of the door, which is obviously a good thing. So I labeled the backside of all my parts before going to the router table just to avoid any confusion. Once that was done, I could swap over to the second bit in the set, the style cutter, which cuts the profile to match the rails, as well as cuts half of the slot for the glazing strip. And the height setting on this bit is much more critical, and I needed to flush up the bottom edge of the slot cutter to the bottom edge of the cope cut. And here's a close-up which hopefully shows you what I'm talking about. So after setting that height, I made the cut on my test piece and then checked the fit, and luckily I was pretty much dead on. As you can see here, you want the bottom face of the cope cut to meet the top face of the sticking cut. Those are the two parts that join together, and you can also see the beginnings of that quarter round glazing strip here. With the bit height set, I could make the cut on the inside edges of all of the boards. I set up a few feather boards here to help keep consistent pressure on the boards as I ran them through the router table, and also used a push stick to keep my hands away from the bit. Once that was done, I could swap over to the last bit in the set, the slot cutter. And this makes a perpendicular cut to the slot cutter on the style bit and finishes cutting that glazing strip. Once again, the height on this cut is pretty critical, so here's another close-up. As you can see, the top edge of the slot cutter needs to be in line with the inside edge of the slot. After setting the height, I set the fence in line with the bearing on the bit again, and then made the cut on my test piece. And as you can see, this cut is made with the board on edge, and the back face of the piece needs to be against the fence. And this cut frees the glazing strip, and here's the finished result, a perfectly matching glazing strip. With the height confirmed on my test piece, I could make the cut on the rest of the pieces, and once again I set up feather boards to help keep consistent pressure. Once I finished making the last pass on the router table, I could test fit the parts, and they fit pretty much perfectly. You can see the beveled edge where the door will meet the glass, and that's a pretty subtle detail that I think looks great. And here's a close-up of the joinery as seen from the ends of the doors. As you can see, there's a ton of glue surface area to these joints, and that's what really makes them so strong. Speaking of which, next I could get the doors glued up, which was a pretty quick process. I applied glue to each end of the rails and then clamped them in place, making sure they were flush with the ends of the stiles. I checked the doors for square by measuring the diagonals and then adding more clamps if I needed to close up any gaps. And I just repeated the process for the rest of the doors, and some of them were slightly out of square when I clamped them, and if that was the case, I would add a clamp diagonally across the door to bring it back into square, which usually required barely any clamping pressure. Most of these doors were less than 1/16 of an inch out of square. Once the glue was dry, I removed the doors from the clamps, and then I could work on getting the glazing strips cut to final length. As you can see, the strips from the stiles needed to be cut to length, but the strips from the rails really just needed to have a miter cut on each end. There were also some little hanging bits left over from the routing, so I first knocked those off with some hand sanding, and then I could cut the miters. And first, I would cut the miter on all 4 strips with the miter saw turned to the left 45 degrees. And on the longer strips, I didn't really need to be precise as I had a few inches of material to cut away, but I wanted the miter to line up exactly with the end of the shorter strips, and the laser line on my miter saw definitely came in handy here. Next, I turned the miter saw to the right 45 degrees and repeated the process, cutting the shorter strips with the miter saw right at the end of the strips. And on the longer strips, I set up a stop block so that they would all match and just to make things go quicker. After cutting the pieces to length, I could test fit the strips and ended up with a nice snug fit, which is exactly what I was looking for here. With the fit confirmed, I just repeated the process on the rest of the strips, and as you can see, I didn't really try to keep the strips corresponding to their specific door, as it didn't really matter if the grain pattern matched perfectly for me since I'd be spraying all of these parts with black poly anyway. When test fitting the strips to the doors, I noticed that the strip was above the surface of the inside face of the door, just due to the thickness of the glass panel. And I wanted to bring the strips down in thickness so that they'd be flush with the door. To do this, I used my drum sander, although a planer might have worked. The nice thing about the drum sander though was it really allowed me to sneak up on the fit, and I ended up with a pretty much perfectly flush strip. While I'm sanding the strips, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Powermatic, the gold standard. So as you guys know, I've added a bunch of Powermatic tools to my shop over the past few years, as you can see in this shot, and they have been total game changers for my woodworking. You might have even noticed the crate with my brand spanking new 12-inch jointer inside in a few of these shots, and I cannot wait to get that beast set up. Anyway, the extra width and gorgeous surface finish from the planer and the precision of the drum sander, just to name a few, have been absolutely amazing, and best of all, I know these tools will last me for many, many years to come and will keep working for me day in and day out. To learn more about these machines and all of my Powermatic tools, check out the links in the video description below, and thanks to Powermatic for sponsoring this week's video and supporting what I do. After sanding, here's how the strips looked, with one flat edge flush with the doors. Once that was done, I could also run the doors themselves through the sander just to remove any extra material and some glue squeeze out. Also, another tip here, I set the height on my drum sander really similarly to how I do it on the planer. I put the piece about halfway through the drum sander, then lower the head until it just touches the piece, and I test this out by turning the drum manually until I feel a little bit of resistance. And I keep that same setting for my first pass, as you really don't want to remove a ton of material with the drum sander, especially on wider pieces like the ends of these doors. And the doors only took a few passes to level out any uneven spots, and then I could move on to drilling the holes for the hinges. This was the exact same process as I covered in the first part of this series, so go check out that video if you want a little bit more detail. But I just used the Craig concealed hinge jig to drill the holes and then dry fit the hinges to confirm the fit. Also, as you might be able to notice, the stiles on these doors were just barely wide enough to support these hinges, so I kind of lucked out there. The last thing to do before sanding was to cut the recessed area for the edge pulls, just like I used on the doors on the base cabinets in the first video in this series. Once again, I covered this process in a little bit more detail in that video, but I set my blade height to match the edge pull and then ran the door across the blade side to side to clear out the material. With that, the doors were ready for finish prep, and I sanded them up to 180 grit. And since I used the drum sander, I had some cross-grain scratches on the rails, so I did need to focus a bit more on removing those, but that went pretty quickly. I also broke all the edges and hand sanded the edges with 180 grit. Also, I've gotten a few questions about this sanding block, which I absolutely love. It has Velcro that matches the backing on my random orbit sanding discs, so I can use them interchangeably. And I'll link to the sanding block in the video description in case you're interested. The last pieces to work on before moving on to finishing were these filler strips. And here's a shot of the SketchUp model to show you how they look in the finished bar. The strips fill in the areas at the top and bottom of the upper cabinets and make the doors sit flush, which just gives the cabinets a little bit more of a finished look. I ripped the strips to rough width of the table saw and then milled them square at the jointer and planer. And I made sure to leave the planer set at that final setting for the door parts earlier to ensure these strips would be the exact same thickness. Finally, I ripped the strips to final width of the table saw, cut them to final length of the miter saw, and then sanded them up to 180 grit. With that, I could move on to spraying the finish, and I used the same black poly that I used for the rest of the cabinets, and finishing went fine, although the glazing strips were kind of a pain, as they were just so light that they wanted to blow away, and I ended up using some painter's tape to hold them in place after applying this first sealer coat to the backs of the strips, and this worked out pretty well. After spraying 3 coats of finish, I could get the glass panels added to the doors. Then I first dropped the glass into place, then dropped in the glazing strips. And to attach the strips, I used pin nails, which are pretty much invisible in the finished doors. I repeated the process on the rest of the doors, and then I could get the edge pulls and hinges installed. Once the hardware was installed, I could load up and head back to the house to install the doors. First, I installed the filler strips, which are flush with the top and bottom edges of the cabinets. I clamped them in place, pre-drilled and countersunk holes from inside the cabinet, then drove in some 1 1/4" screws. Next, I could install the mounting plates for the hinges inside the cabinets, and I used the same method as when I installed the hinges on the lower cabinets in the first video in this series, except that I used some painter's tape to keep from having to mark on the cabinets themselves. With the holes drilled, I could attach the hinge plates with screws and then attach the doors, making any necessary adjustments to get a nice even reveal. And I just repeated that process for the rest of the doors, and I could call this part of the build complete.
All right, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I really love the way these doors came together. I think they really tied together all of these upper cabinets. Also, if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and get subscribed and ring that little notification bell so you don't miss next week's video, which will be part 4 in this series on building the butcher block countertop. So if you guys are looking to build doors like this for yourself, I'll link to that router bit set in the video description below. I'll also have links to all of the tools and materials that I used on this project. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this series. Hopefully I'll see you next week. And until next time, happy building.